Welcome to the Raw Coding YouTube channel. My name is Anton. Today we're going to be talking about cookies. If you understand the authentication landscape, you understand that cookies are at the center of it. If you understand cookies, you know that your authentication solution is secure. We'll go through the simplest possible example of obtaining a cookie, and then we're going to dig into the various options and underlying infrastructure of how cookies work in ASP.NET Core, how you can configure them, and then how they behave in the browser. Let's go ahead and get started. Here we have a simple application that's already running, and I'm just going to start filling it out. We're going to have an MVC and a JavaScript example. If you're wondering about spas, just take the JavaScript example and do exactly the same thing. It's just a fetch. And if you're wondering about frameworks like Nuxt and Next.js, we are going to take a closer look at them later because they have a server-side rendered component, which have some specific scenarios that you need to deal with. Let's start with the MVC example. I am going to add default controller route, and I will add controllers to services. Services, add controllers. This now allows me to pick up controllers from my file directory. So directory, controllers. And here I can have my home controller, and this home controller doesn't need to be too complicated. For demonstration purposes, all we're trying to do is issue out a cookie. Here's the skeleton for the action that is going to help us sign in or deal out a cookie. What we have to do is first we have to create a claims principal. We have to convert that claims principal to a cookie. The thing that does the conversion will be an authentication handler, specifically a cookie authentication handler, which is built into ASP.NET Core. First, let's take the HTTP context, and on here we will call the sign-in async function. This is going to trigger the underlying cookie handler. In my authentication video, I showed how this function routes back to the cookie handler, and in the cookie handler, how it then deals out the cookie. Here we want to specify a claims principal, and we will await on this function. Inside the claims principal, we will supply a claims identity. Inside the claims identity, we will need to specify a bunch of claims. Amongst all of those claims, I will specify a claim that will just contain a user ID. There is a static class present in the .NET framework, which just contains a bunch of names for all the claims, one of which is name identifier, which represents a user ID. I'm just going to assign a GUID to it and convert it to string so it actually fits the claim. Here is the basic way that you're going to attempt to sign in. Now you just need to be able to select the mechanism which is going to perform the conversion of the claims principal to a cookie. The mechanism, the way that you register the mechanism is through going to Builder, Services, adding Authentication, and then on here you specify the mechanism. You can add schema, add your own custom mechanism, or a pre-built one, which is going to come in the form of add cookie. And just to make things simple, I'm going to call this the default mechanism. This is called an authentication schema. If you don't specify this, automatically by default, it will just be a string of cookies. All I'm doing is I'm opting in to just call this default. I will now have to specify that I'm signing in under this cookie authentication schema, and that this cookie authentication schema is also the identity provider. Before I do this, let's run the application and see what happens when we try to hit this endpoint. We're gonna get an error, but let's just make sure that we see what the error looks like. First of all, I will need to use authentication. This is the thing that is going to try to pick up the cookie, open it up, and read it using the cookie handler that is registered as part of add cookie. I will also use static files, and I'm going to create an HTML page in a www root folder, which is just going to submit a form to that endpoint. Here is my mvc.html inside the www root folder. Let's go ahead and add the form. And here is the simplest form that I could come up with. Again, we are going to have an error because we're not specifying the authentication schemas on here. Let's come back to the browser, and the application is already running, by the way. And I can see that there is an error that I haven't added controllers, and that's actually add connections. So add controllers, there we go, that I believe will restart. While that's restarting, let's talk a little bit about the developer tools. When you're working with authentication and you're working with cookies and you're trying to understand what is going on, your only option is the network tab and the application tab. Those are the main points of interception of communication between your browser and your backend. Forget about the logs. The network tab is your best friend, and to inspect the state of cookies, the application tab is your best friend. Let's go to MVC.html. Here we're going to find the login button, and from the beginning we have no cookies. And the network tab, make sure you have preserve logon. That is just going to keep the history as it's going along. If we take a look at MVC.html, and in the response headers, that is when the response is being returned to the browser. This is what we're going to see. And then these are the request headers. So this is when the request is being made to the backend. So request is out from the browser to the server. Response is back from the server to the browser. I'm going to clear the logs. I'm going to press login. And first of all, what we're going to see is the request not containing a cookie and the response not containing a cookie either. And we can see that we're getting a 500. And again, I said that we are about to get an exception. And this is what the issue looks like when you're not specifying authentication schemas under which you're trying to sign in. Let's come back around here. We will grab our authentication schema. We will specify that we are signing in as this authentication schema, and that the identity provider is this authentication schema as well. If you don't understand what I mean by signing in an identity provider, think of it this way. Your identity may come from Facebook, so you're signing in externally. They are the providers of your identity. And then you're signing in locally, you're dealing out a local cookie to represent that authentication session. So they're the providers, you're the one who deals out the sign-in session. This is what these two values will represent. Now that we have specified these, let's come back over here, come back to MVC.html. We still shouldn't have any cookies, and the network tab should look something like this. So I'll clear it, I'm gonna log in, and we're gonna get a 200 response. If I open up login, we are gonna see that there is a set cookie header and a cookie value with a couple of parameters, which we're just about to go to. The original request that's made does not contain any cookies. Now, what I want to highlight is once the cookie is in the browser, any new request that is made is going to contain the cookie for that specific domain in the request, right? So the cookie will be automatically attached to each request that is made from this same domain. If we take a look in the application tab, we are going to see that we have a name of the cookie, which is just prefixed by this authentication schema that we have. Then there is the value. The value is essentially what we've gone ahead and created over here. The claim's identity is stored, encrypted inside the cookie. Then we have the domain, or which domain is this cookie dealt out. Then we have the path, which is essentially for which path is it valid, which we will take a look a little bit closer. We then have session, how long does this cookie exist for? Then there is the size, which is essentially the size of the payload. HTTP only, is this cookie allowed only to be used over HTTP? And you're going to see how this value can be configured and affected. Secure means that it goes over HTTPS or not. Same site can be none, lax, or strict. This controls at which point the cookie is actually attached to the request. So we will take a look at the examples of this as well. Then we have the other cookies, which are same party, priority, and partition key. These are not so important for security as more for privacy and specific feature enabling. To cut this video short, we're not going to be talking about these, but rather primarily focusing on the other ones. Starting with the name. Let's, for example, say that we want to name our cookie differently. For this, you have the options that you can specify for the cookie. O.cookie, and do feel free to walk around. Have a look at what this is. Open add cookie. You can see that you're meant to be supplying an action of cookie authentication options. And this is the value that you're essentially configuring. Have a read through the documentation, see what's on here, see if you can try to make sense of it. But on the cookie over here, you have the name, and we can configure it to something like my cookie. Place a semicolon on the end, come back over here, come back to this MVC page, login. I'm just gonna re-log in. If I take a look at the login call over here, actually I want to take a look at the bottom login call, not the first one, because I have preserve log on. So when I travel between pages, the whole log is kept. Coming back to the bottom, I can see that on the request, the cookie is present and it's the default cookie. Once I have re-logged in, I can see that there is a set cookie header. And by the way, set cookie means issue a command to the browser to save the cookie in the browser, and whoever is the browser vendor, Google, Chrome, Firefox, have to implement the feature of saving a cookie in the browser when the set cookie header is present. Now if we take a look at the application, both of the cookies are present over here. Obviously the old one, we no longer want to be using it. We're more interested in just the my cookie. Let's clear both of these, and the next bit that we're going to take a look at is the value. Coming back to the home controller, where I said that the value is essentially the payload of the identity. If we duplicate this line of code and we just start putting in bogus claims into the cookie, so let's say I'm increasing the amount of data I'm jamming into the cookie, and it starts looking something like this. If I come back around here, we come back to the login page, and again we log in. If we take a look at the response headers, the cookie section is gonna start to be quite big. If we take a look at the application session, essentially the maximum size of the cookie is 4008. ASP.NET Core internally is gonna make sure that your cookie is of optimal size, and it's going to chunk it into multiple cookies to then, once they are reattached with the request, are going to be brought in back together to essentially extract the value from it. If we come back around to the hello world example over here, the change is not reflected immediately, but if I refresh, we can see that the chunked cookies are in here as well. And if I take a look at the network tab and the latest request that was made, when you're making the request, so pardon for scrolling, the response does not set cookie, because this is the bit which forces the set cookie header. The bottom bit, the cookie that's being attached automatically, it will be attaching all chunks. You don't want to be storing all the values in your cookie. You want to be storing an identifier and then retrieving additional data on your backend, because otherwise you're making your requests bigger than they need to be. Now that we had a look at generating a cookie this way, let's take a look at generating a cookie through a JavaScript example. For this, we're going to come back to Program CS. We're going to use minimal APIs. And by the way, if you're using MVC, you may use form data to post to the backend. Minimal APIs don't allow form data. You will need to be using JavaScript. So that's what we're going to be doing. Let's implement a login endpoint. We're going to go to the home controller, take this statement where we were signing in, bring it back to our program CS and replace the hello world with the sign in function. I'm going to remove all of these claims that we were attaching and keep the name identifier to keep the cookie small. And throughout the rest of the video, we are going to be using this endpoint. I'm just going to return an OK payload. I need the HTTP context for my ID to recognize. So by default, minimal API is capable of injecting HTTP context into the method over here. And now I can import sign in async extension function and make the method asynchronous. Now I can log in through this method using some JavaScript. Again, I can copy MVC, say that this is JS HTML, replace this with a script tag and put my JavaScript over here to sign in. Here's the script tag. I have 3 functions on here, one for login, one to fetch the root, and one to fetch a test page that we don't have yet, but it's for a scenario that we're going to cover in a little bit. Coming back to program CS, I'm just going to make sure that this is map post to match the method that I'm specifying over here. Coming back to the browser, I'm going to close this page, and here I'm going to navigate to js.html. I'm going to clear the cookie, I'm going to come back to the console, and here I'm going to fire a login function. Again, I can inspect what happened with this login function if I go to the network tab and I take a look at the login call. Here I can see I hit the login endpoint. Because I erased the cookies before I made this request, I can expect that there isn't going to be a cookie header attached to the request. However, because I'm signing in on the other endpoint, I have the cookie in my response. Now, if I go to the console and I make my JavaScript requests and not tests, sorry, it's going to be the hello world request, every single subsequent JavaScript request that I'm going to be making, so here's one to the root, that is also going to include the cookies, same as regular HTTP requests. So if I'm going to be reloading the page, so gs.html is going to load again, on that initial request, that is when the cookie is going to be attached. If you're building spas at this point and you don't have server-side rendering because .NET Core as C# doesn't run Node.js JavaScript, you cannot server-side render your JavaScript application. So if you want user information, you cannot unencrypt the cookie on your JavaScript side. You need to make an additional request to your backend, extract information from http context.user, map it to some kind of custom user object, and then return the value, and then you can actually store it in some kind of centralized storage. So we have our cookie. Let's come back to it and let's take a look at a couple of more values here. We have the domain, and I already have a video out where I show how to leverage the domain to implement single sign-on for your SPA applications, or if you have not only SPA applications but multiple applications, as long as they're on the same root domain, that cookie is going to work for all of them. You sign in on one domain and then you're going to be signed in on all of the other ones. The next value is the path. That is not necessarily security related. However, you can have multiple applications, and I have used this feature as well, where you can restrict the cookie to be valid on specific paths. So you can host many applications and use a reverse proxy to route requests to different applications based on the path. So you can say rawcoding.dev/app1/app2/app3 and scope these to those specific paths. So you don't even need multiple domains or utilize the domain to do single sign-on. Let's take a look at setting the domain and the path. If we take a look at where we're configuring the cookie, we have cookie, and we can set the domain. So here you configure the domain generally for development and production. You will read the domain from some kind of configuration. And if you set the domain to something like nothing, browser will automatically pick it up and set it as the domain which you're currently on. For the path, let's say cookie path, and we're going to set it to /test. Again, if you're wondering why path is important, you can essentially implement single sign-on using path, okay? Assuming all of your applications are internal. Let's come back to console. Here we will say login, come back to network, and we'll take a look at login, and we will see the cookie for the path test. However, if we come back to application and I will refresh, we will still see the old my cookie, and I will actually remove it. What we don't see is the test my cookie. For this, I am going to add a directory, test, and I'm going to copy js.html into there so we can visit this same page but on the test route, /test, and here's the cookie. So we can request the cookie on a lower path and then be able to get that cookie once we actually visit that path. And that cookie can only be used when we're on that path. So if we go to network, and I will actually clear it, let me refresh the page. Because this page is located on /test js.html, we're gonna see the cookie being attached to the request. If we go back to js.html, we're gonna see that the cookie is no longer attached. And this is how you can authenticate multiple applications based on a path. Let's remove the path so we can keep working with the cookie. In the console, let's re-log in. In the network tab, again, in the login, response header, we have the cookie, application. The cookie is now set. We've taken a look at the domain and path. The session takes a little bit more to configure, and we will take a look at it. Size is not that interesting. HTTP only, secure, and same site. The next three flags that we will look at HTTP only means that the cookie is only capable of being transferred over HTTP. If the cookie is not being transferred over HTTP, what else is it good for? Well, if you go into console, you type in document, and document is reachable through JavaScript, and you type in cookie, you will notice that nothing is in here. Let's come back. Same as other things. In the cookie, we will look for HTTP only flag, and we will set it to false. Let's come back. We'll call login. I'll skip the network tab and we'll go straight to the application. Now HTTP only flag is set to false. That means that the cookie is not intended to only go over HTTP. If we bring in document.cookie, now we can access this secure cookie through JavaScript. The problem with this is if your front-end application is vulnerable to cross-site scripting attacks, that means, let's say you're redirecting to some kind of page, and in the URL query you're putting something like successfully added record to database or something like that. Somebody will put JavaScript in there, and that JavaScript can essentially extract the cookie from other users' signed in session and then either post it to another domain or send it as a message to another user that is using your application. So it's essentially a cross-site scripting vulnerability, something that you don't want to happen. So never really want to set that flag to true unless it's some kind of miscellaneous information that you want to give your front-end application. The next flag that we wanted to look at is secure. And the secure flag is really simple, which I'm not actually going to demonstrate. So secure policy, you can have none, always, or same as site. Secure policy just basically means, is it allowed to go over HTTP? As a rule of thumb, you always want this to be secure. If you set this to none, the secure flag will be off, meaning that you can send cookie over HTTP, which is insecure traffic, which leaves you open to man-in-the-middle attacks, okay? So you never want to set that to none either. The next option is same site policy. Cookie, same site. You have lax, non-strict, unspecified. Lax, treat it as default. If you set it to unspecified, browsers will basically say you want lax. Non, lax, and strict is the order in which it goes. The same site flag is important for cross-site request forgery. That means a site evil.com has a link that redirects to your site. You've already seen how if there is a cookie in the browser on a domain, it automatically attaches it to every request. Well, if you have an external website that forges some kind of malicious request on your website and the user that is using the evil website is already signed in on your website, the evil website can redirect the user to your website and execute a post or a delete action, delete some kind of record or send money or something like that. None essentially enables this attack. Lax only allows GET requests. So most of the time, lax is okay to have because you're gonna have a redirect between websites, especially when you're enabling things like Auth or OpenID Connect, when you need to travel between websites, and if you want somebody to redirect from an external website to your website and that request to still be authenticated and not error, you actually want lax. However, if evil.com tries to make an HTTP post or HTTP delete, lax is going to stop that request. Finally, if you have strict, any request that essentially forces the user to go onto your domain will be blocked. Strict will restrict requests to only come from the same site. Lax will allow only GET requests from external sites, otherwise it's the same as strict. None is not secure. I would not recommend to use none unless the cookies are very temporal. Temporal meaning temporary, they are short-lived and are used as intermediary objects to store some data about your user. So here by default you will have lax, and this is generally the option that you want to keep. If you actually want to see an example of how the same site flag behaves, I recommend you go watch my cross-site request forgery video. Lastly, we have the expires and max age currently set to session. If you close the browser and open it, your cookie will be gone. in order to actually persist the cookie, that means for the cookie to remain in the browser, persist over browser closure, you want to be able to mark it as persistent. Currently, you have options like cookie expiration. Doesn't work. You don't want to be setting none of that. You have expired time span, which is what you want to set to specify how long the cookie can exist for. However, in order to first say that the cookie should be persisted, you need to specify authentication properties. As you're signing in besides the claim principal, so that's where it ends, you want to specify the authentication properties. And by the way, please open it. Please take a look at the properties that are contained here. And I'm going to show you how you can see how these properties are being used by the cookie authentication handler. Here you want to say is persistent and mark it to true. Let's come back to console, log in, come back to network, log in. We'll take a look at the cookie. Expires is now set to be on 22nd of October. If we take a look at the application, here is the time that it expires. Coming back to the application, let's configure the expire time span to be from, or time span from seconds. Let's put 10 seconds here. Coming back to the browser, console, let's re-log in. And here I can call hello world if I remember. So that should be good. And actually we don't have an authenticated endpoint, so that should always be good. However, when the age expires, the browser is actually going to automatically eject the cookie. So let's do that again. And once the expiration actually sets in, the cookie should be ejected. I don't know if this UI is reactive. I guess I just gotta keep mumbling, but yeah, if I refresh, that is now gone. Back to the app, let's introduce a endpoint that is going to be authenticated. I will add /test. This can still have hello world, and however, it is going to require authorization. To do authorization, I will need to say services add authorization. This is going to add underlying services which are going to pick up the cookie, see what kind of user has been loaded in there, and check. Watch my authorization video if you want more information. And then we want the actual use authorization middleware, which is going to utilize these services. Because by default, I'm not specifying any authentication, authorization mechanisms aren't gonna know which cookie to test. For this, I need to take my authentication schema, which represents my cookie, and set it as the default authentication schema, so I don't have to be creating any policies. Coming back to the browser, let's reissue this cookie. So here we have login, hello world. Let's call this a couple of times. And because the cookie is going to be ejected at some point, like a silly bastard, I'm calling hello world, but I want to be calling test. And that is going to give me a HTTP error. No middleware that supports authorization. I have added use authentication. So use authorization. Just double checking that I haven't misspelled that. Let's come back, and this time I'm not gonna be calling hello world. I'm gonna be calling test properly. Okay, so this will succeed. And after waiting a little bit, something weird is going on here. We're not being unauthenticated. Let's go to the network tab. Let's go to test. And before this, we can actually go to application. Okay, here we have a cookie that resides at /test. However, if I refresh, nothing is there, right? So if I call test again, this cookie suddenly appears here. So my understanding is the test cookie is the thing that's being attached. So there is the my cookie. We never changed the name, so it's a little bit confusing why this cookie is being attached. Okay, but let me go ahead and clear that cookie. Let me double check that test is giving us a 403, which is forbidden, but really it's redirecting us to this path. Re-log in, actually call the function. Now we can call test a couple of times. The cookie is ejected at some point, and we stop hitting the test endpoint. Now, if you don't want to be in a situation where your user is using the application and suddenly gets timed out, you can use a sliding expiration set to true. If we come back around and wait for a refresh, call login and start calling test. If I call test, wait 5 seconds, call test again, wait 5 seconds again, finally call test. Let's take a look at the network tab. The first test, we attach the cookie, nothing gets returned in the response. In the next test, we can see that the set cookie header is present. So it's not an authentication endpoint which is giving us this cookie, it is a regular endpoint. Again, this is the authentication service that you're registering that is at work here. The next test call that we're making, no cookie in the response header, the cookie is being attached, and every single time it's about to expire or at a good time until expiration, this cookie is going to get reattached and restored in the application. Obviously, now that I've been talking, it is no longer there, but that is what the sliding expiration is doing. Those are mainly the configuration that you can do for the cookie. Let's take a look a little bit closer at the internals of the cookie. I'm going to close the rest of the tabs and we're going to take a look at points of interest. Perhaps here you want to follow along if you have ReSharper or Get Writer from the description. Let's open up Add Cookie. Here we're going to find a couple of extension functions. Generally with these extensions functions, what you're looking for is right at the bottom. The call to add schema. First thing you have the options. The second thing, generally it's always the handler. Let's open up the handler and I'm going to pin it. Pin tab. Now I'm going to look for three things: forbidden, challenge, and authenticate. Let's look for authenticate. That might be a little bit of a lost cause because everything is going to have authenticate on here. Essentially, let's just find it by looking through. So handle authenticate. I'm going to put a breakpoint over here, and handle authenticate is responsible for loading your authentication session out of the cookie. Scrolling down and looking for the challenge. Here we have handle sign in. If you want, place a breakpoint over here, call the login function, see it reach here, and have a look through the variables. Closer to the bottom is where we find the other 2 points of interest, which will be handle forbidden and handle challenge. You can see here in handle challenge, handle forbidden, we have the authentication properties. So when we initialize these flows, and we can supply authentication properties, which you can then inspect here and take a look at how they work. The big difference between challenge and forbidden: challenge is 401, we don't know who you are, go and challenge you. I don't know what the terminology is here, who came up with that, but that's what challenge is for. Forbidden is 403, you're not allowed, buddy, which is more of an authorization concern. If I look for actions and attach debugger to my application, come back to the browser and call test. The first thing that we're going to see is handle authenticate triggered. The reason handle authenticate is being triggered first, because first we need to know, who are you? Is there a cookie present? We're going to try to read something. The result at this point is not successful, so I'm just going to press play here and we're going to go to the next stage, which is handle challenge async. We tried to look at who you are. We tried to load the cookie. Cookie was not found. Too bad. You need to go and authenticate. The redirect URI here is not specified, and we can also see why that happens. The redirect URI that is being constructed, it is for /test. So the current URL that we're trying to reach. We then, from the options, lift the login path, which is set to account/login, which is really a big dependency on the identity framework and Microsoft pushing that identity framework. But really, you want a path to your login screen here, right? Which is then concatenated with the redirect URI or return URL. And then the additional authentication request is for the 404 page that we try to hit, but it's not there. So that's the challenge being hit there when we're not authenticated and we're trying to reach an endpoint. If we come back to program CS and we have some kind of endpoint, I'm going to call it test 22. The situation you might be in is you may have multiple identities, and when a person enters a certain flow of this endpoint and you want to be able to say, okay, you have been authenticated, but you haven't been through this flow. And you can represent these flows using cookies rather than some entities in the database. So if you haven't been through this flow, go through this flow. Let's replace the lambda with HTTP context and we can say, look, you haven't been authenticated with this authentication session. Therefore, I'm going to say challenge async. I want to challenge you. And I want to challenge you with this schema, some kind of business flow X. We are not providing a claims principal. However, here we can supply an authentication properties. Is persistent doesn't really make sense here. We're not dealing out cookies. However, now redirect URI makes sense. Why? It makes sense because we know that underneath the hood, if we look for handle challenge async, we can see how it's being used. If redirect URI is set, that is what is going to be appended on the end of the login path when we redirect there. Coming back to program CS, we can set this to anything that we want. And when we come back around and we call test 22, we're going to get the regular redirect because this is still requires authorization. So let's remove authorization and let's try test 22 again. This time we're going to get redirected to anything that we want. The reason is persisted makes sense over here is when we go into sign in async, this will extract an iAuthentication service interface and call a sign in async function. This interface has an implementation of a regular authentication service, and I can reach it through going this way, or I can close these services, come back to program CS, and when we register add authentication, as part of add authentication, when we register authentication core, this is where the authentication service has been registered. If I open authentication service here, I can find authenticate async. This is the thing that is going to trigger the loading of the authentication session from the cookie. The actual sign-in that is being performed can be found over here. We are passing authentication properties over here. If again we take a look at the properties, how they're going to be passed down all the way into the signing handler. So we find the authentication handler and put the properties back into it. So if we go back around to the cookie authentication handler, we look for sign in async and we find handle sign in async. We can see these authentication properties and we can take a look at how they look like. We highlight them, scroll down a little bit without making things unnecessarily complicated and not going too deep. Once we have the sign in context on the properties, we will have the is persisted options set. So from properties through the cookie sign in context, the is persistent option on the sign in context is going to be set. And that is when it is going to actually apply the expire time span from your options. Okay, so things make sense once you actually take a look at the internals and you see how your options are being used once you apply them here. This is why I encourage you, go ahead, open up that code and take a look at how things tie in from both ends. Now, if we go to cookie authenticate handler and we wanted to trigger requirements, the forbidden clause, we have to enter a authorization failure. So we have to fail some kind of authorization. For this, we will need to build a policy which we have to fail. Add policy, my policy, and this is going to be a bogus policy builder where I will require a claim that doesn't exist with a nonsense value. And just to be sure, I am going to require an authenticated user. I can now take this policy and place it on the test endpoint. I will not forget to attach a debugger so we can actually see the debugging breakpoint being hit. And furthermore, we're going to understand that that handler is being executed from the authorization middleware. Let's open up authorization. Let's open up authorization middleware. Scroll down a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean all the way to the bottom. At the very bottom here, we have the handle function where after performing a bunch of logic of loading the cookie, does it match the correct rules? Does it have the claim that we have asked for? If we go inside, this is going to be the authorization middleware result handler, which is the implementation for the iAuthentication middleware result handler interface. It's going to see what the result is. It's going to be challenged if the cookie is not present, and it's going to be forbidden if the cookie is present, but we do not meet the policy requirements. So let's see both of these. With that running, we have no cookie. Let's go to the test endpoint. Here we're gonna load up the session first, and here we enter the challenged clause, okay? Which after we enter the challenge async of the authentication service, which is an intermediate point. So same as we call sign in async on an HTTP context, authentication middleware result handler will call challenge async on the HTTP context as well, which is kind of what we've did in our endpoint as well. So this will then propagate the call into the cookie authentication handler, and that will finally redirect you to your destination. And this is the authentication attempt from the 404 over here. Now let's go to JS HTML. Here we will log in. I don't want to touch that. So log in. I think I have like 10 seconds to call test. Real quick. Boom. So again, we load up the session, and now because we're not meeting the claim requirements, we're going down the forbidden path. Again, this is going to call forbidden async and HTTP context extension. Under the hood, if you travel down, it will surface the iAuthentication service and then call forbid async, which will then finally propagate into handle forbid of the cookie authentication handler. If you take a look at that method, you can see which parameters it's using, where it's going to redirect you, and which options you should be using. And that is going to land us on error aborted. And by the way, same as cookies are just request headers. The way that you get redirected from place to place is if we take a look at the test request, you get a 302 status code, which stands for redirect, and then you have a location header, which says go over there. Browser automatically picks it up and actually sends you there, but that page is not found. The last and final bit that you should know about cookies is how to sign out and how sign out happens. Now we left it out towards the end, but let's implement it. We'll copy this endpoint, place it over here, sign out. Instead of sign in async, we sign out async. We specify the schema. Authentication properties can be present. We can actually verify this. Come into the cookie authentication handler, sign out async. If we specify authentication properties, they are. How are they being used? We can take a look at the cookie sign out context, or same as before, we can take the context, take a look at it, and see if properties are being utilized in any manner. Right, so if we are concerned, if we want to somehow try to configure this flow, we may see how properties or which properties on the authentication properties are being used. Coming back to program CS, this is how the sign out is going to happen. I will call this map get, save, redirect. Let's go to sign out, call this request, and we're going to get OK. So on the sign out, all we'll see is that set cookie is being set to nothing. That is going to force the removal of the cookie. And for this, I'm going to remove my expiration. I'll duplicate the tab and I'll go to JS HTML. Let's open up the console and let's log in. So I actually have a long-standing cookie that expires on like 22nd of October. Now on this network tab, let me clear everything. If I go to the application, the cookie is still there. If I refresh, it's no longer going to be there. And that's because in the network tab, I'm calling the sign out page, which wipes my cookie through the set cookie header. Same as you can only set cookies on your domain, you can only delete cookies on your domain as well. So if you are signed in to multiple applications and you sign out from one application and you want to propagate the sign out to all the other applications, you need to either redirect the user or have some kind of state on the back end, which is going to fail authorization or sign the user out if some kind of global sign out has been triggered. You now know how to trigger individual sign-out mechanisms through these functions which are present on the HTTP context. So if you were in that scenario, you'd know that you want to call the sign-out async. At which point do you want to call the sign-out async? Well, at the point of loading the authentication session. At which point is the authentication session being loaded? In the cookie authentication handler. In the authenticate function, if I can reach it, right over here. You can override the handle authenticate async function where if it does indeed lift a cookie, you can take that value, check against the database, and if that database marks this user as being invalid, you go ahead and call the sign out function from this very handler itself and then also call the challenge. So you'd sign out and either redirect to the sign out page, or you'd sign out and redirect to the login page. And this will be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, bell notification. I think this is the first time I'm asking for the bell notification. But if you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments. If you want to say thank you, make sure to leave it in the comments as well. Come support me and get the source code on my Patreon. Link is in the description. Big thank you to all of my patrons that are already supporting me. Hope everyone is staying healthy out there and have a good day.